There's a smell you never forget once you've worked trauma medicine in a combat zone. It's not the blood. People always think it's the blood. Blood smells like copper pennies and wet rust, and you get used to that inside of a week. No, the smell that stays with you, the one that crawls into the lining of your nostrils and sets up permanent residence, is the cocktail. It's iodine and burnt metal and diesel exhaust and sweat, soaked Kevlar and the particulate ozone, sharp tang of electrical equipment running too hot for too long in air that was never meant to be breathed by anything with lungs. You layer 20 years of that smell into your skin, into your hair, into the fibers of every uniform you've ever worn, and it becomes part of you. It becomes your cologne, your signature. The thing that tells anyone paying attention that you didn't learn medicine from a textbook in a climate-controlled lecture hall. You learned it with your hands inside someone's chest cavity while mortar rounds shook the ceiling tiles loose above your head. My name doesn't matter for this story, and even if it did, I wouldn't give it to you. What matters is what I am, which is an Air Force flight surgeon who cross-trained into emergency trauma medicine and spent the better part of 2 decades rotating through every godforsaken forward operating base the Department of Defense saw fit to plant a flag on. I started as a captain fresh out of residency at Wright-Patterson, bright-eyed and stupid, and convinced I was going to save the world one patient at a time. 20 years later, I was a lieutenant colonel who'd saved enough of the world to know that the world doesn't much care whether you save it or not, and the people who try hardest to save it are usually the ones it chews up first. By the time this story takes place, I was the senior medical officer at a FOBA I'll call Outpost Meridian. It was a joint operations base, which meant Air Force, Army, a handful of Navy corpsmen attached to a Marine advisory unit, and enough acronyms in the command structure to give a Pentagon bureaucrat a migraine. My medical section was small, 12 personnel, including myself. But we were tight. We ran a Role 2 medical facility, which for the civilians listening means we could do emergency surgery, hold casualties for up to 72 hours, and stabilize patients for medevac to a Role 3 hospital at the main base. We weren't a hospital. We were the reason people survived long enough to reach one. I'd been running that facility for 14 months when this story begins, and I'd built something I was genuinely proud of. My team knew their jobs cold. Response times from alarm to patient contact were under 3 minutes. We'd treated everything from heat stroke to blast injuries to a memorable incident involving a contractor, a forklift, and a truly heroic misunderstanding about the load capacity of a shipping container. We had a rhythm. We had protocols that had been refined through blood and repetition, and the kind of institutional knowledge that you can't download from a PowerPoint slide. And then Ensign Derek Whitmore arrived. I remember the exact moment because I was elbow deep in a supply audit when my senior NCO, Master Sergeant Rice, leaned into the doorway of my office with an expression on her face that I had learned to associate with incoming bad news. Reyes had been with me for 3 rotations. She was 5'2", built like a fire hydrant, and had the kind of quiet competence that made her worth more than any 3 officers I'd ever served with combined. When Rice looked worried, I got worried. She told me we had a new division officer inbound, assigned to oversee base medical operations as part of a joint services efficiency initiative that someone at CNTOM had apparently dreamed up during a particularly boring staff meeting. The officer was Navy, an ensign fresh out of officer candidate school. And Rice paused here because she had a flair for dramatic timing that would have served her well on Broadway. His pre-commission background was in management consulting. He had an MBA from a mid-tier business school, 0 deployments, 0 clinical experience, and had been in uniform for less than 5 months. I sat back in my chair, I took off my reading glasses, I pinched the bridge of my nose, and I said very quietly, words that I will not repeat here because this is a family-friendly channel, but which accurately conveyed my assessment of the situation. You have to understand something about the military that civilians often get wrong. Rank matters, it matters enormously. But in a combat zone, on a FOB, there's another currency that matters just as much, and sometimes more, and that currency is competence. An experienced sergeant who's been downrange for years carries weight that a brand new officer simply hasn't earned yet. Good officers know this. Good officers walk in quiet, listen hard, learn the terrain, and earn their authority through demonstrated judgment. The best commanding officer I ever served under, a full bird colonel named Patterson, spent his first 2 weeks at a new post doing nothing but shadowing his NCOs and asking questions. By the time he started making decisions, his people would have followed him into a volcano because they knew he understood what he was deciding. Ensign Derek Whitmore was not Colonel Patterson. He arrived on a Tuesday logistics flight, stepping off the C-130 ramp in a uniform so knew it practically squeaked, carrying a leather portfolio and a laptop bag and an expression of barely contained excitement that made him look like a golden retriever who'd just been told he was going to the park. He was 26 years old, clean shaven, had a handshake that was just a little too firm, the kind of handshake they teach you in business school seminars about power dynamics. And within the first 10 minutes of meeting him, he used the phrase operational efficiency metrics 3 times. I gave him the tour. I showed him the trauma bay, the pre-op area, the supply storage, the sterilization station, the triage protocols posted on the wall in laminated sheets that Ray's had color coded because she was a genius. I explained our response procedures, our casualty evacuation chain, our standing agreements with the medevac pilots. I walked him through 20 months of institutional knowledge compressed into a 45-minute walking brief. And I watched his eyes the entire time. He wasn't listening. Not really. Oh, he was nodding and he was writing things down in his portfolio with a mechanical pencil, and he made the right noises at the right times. But I've briefed enough people in my career to know the difference between someone who's absorbing information and someone who's waiting for their turn to talk. Whitmore was already composing his counter argument before I'd finished my opening statement. I could see it in the way his eyes kept drifting to the ceiling corners, to the equipment layout, to the supply shelves, not with curiosity, but with assessment. He was already cataloging what he was going to change. The first sign of real trouble came 72 hours later. Whitmore called a meeting. He loved meetings the way some people love breathing, and presented what he called his operational realignment plan. He'd put together a slide deck, an actual PowerPoint presentation on an FOB in a combat zone. It had graphics and transition animations and a color scheme that I think was supposed to evoke corporate professionalism, but mostly evoked the migraine. His plan had 3 pillars. First, he wanted to reduce our medical supply buffer from a 45-day reserve to a 20-day reserve. His reasoning was that we were over-inventoried relative to our patient volume, and that the excess supplies represented capital that could be reallocated. Second, he wanted to restructure our on-call rotation to reduce the number of medical personnel on standby during low activity periods, which he had identified using, I am not making this up, a statistical analysis of our patient intake logs over the previous 6 months. Third, and this was the one that made my blood pressure spike, he wanted to consolidate our 2 separate trauma response teams into a single team to eliminate redundancy. I let him finish his presentation. I asked my team to leave the room. And then I sat down across from him and explained as calmly and clearly and professionally as I could manage why every single element of his plan was going to get somebody killed. The supply buffer existed because our resupply chain was unreliable. Convoys got delayed. Flights got canceled. We'd had a period 4 months earlier where a sandstorm grounded all logistics flights for 11 days. 11 days. If we'd been running a 20-day buffer, we would have been rationing tourniquets by day 9. The on-call rotation existed because mass casualty events don't consult a statistical model before they happen. The whole point of the rotation was that we were always ready for the thing we couldn't predict, and the 2 trauma teams existed because we might and had twice received multiple critical casualties simultaneously. You cannot run 2 simultaneous emergency surgeries with 1 team. That's not an opinion, that's arithmetic. Whitmore listened to all of this with the patient, slightly condescending expression of someone who has been trained to hear out stakeholder objections before implementing his plan anyway. When I finished, he smiled, a small, tight corporate smile, and said, and I quote, I appreciate your perspective, Colonel, but I think you'll find that data-driven optimization can achieve outcomes that intuition-based approaches miss. We need to be willing to challenge legacy thinking. Legacy thinking. He called 20 years of combat medicine legacy thinking. I felt something shift inside my chest like the click of a safety being thumbed off a weapon. And I realized in that moment that I was dealing with a very specific and very dangerous type of person. Not malicious, not evil, just so profoundly certain of his own framework that he was physically incapable of recognizing its limitations. He had a hammer, his MBA, his consulting methodology, his spreadsheets, and every problem in the world looked like a nail. I went through the chain of command. I drafted a formal memorandum outlining my concerns and submitted it to the base commander, an Army colonel named Jeffries, who was competent but overworked and generally inclined to let his division officers handle their own areas of responsibility. Jeffries read my memo, called Whitmore in for a meeting, and Whitmore apparently dazzled him with projected cost savings that looked very impressive on a spreadsheet and very terrifying to anyone who understood what those numbers actually represented in the real world. Jeffries told me to work with the new officer and give the system a chance to prove itself. I went to Rise that night. We sat in my office with the door closed, and I told her exactly what I thought was going to happen, and then I told her what we were going to do about it. We were going to comply fully, completely, to the letter. Every order Whitmore gave, we were going to execute precisely as specified with zero deviation, zero initiative. Zero of the thousand small judgment calls and adaptations that experienced medical personnel make every day without even thinking about it. We were going to follow his plan like it was holy scripture, and we were going to document every single moment of it. Reyes looked at me for a long time. Then she nodded once slowly and said, "I'll start the documentation log tonight." And so we did. We reduced our supply buffer. We restructured the on-call rotation. We consolidated the trauma teams. And I made sure that every change was logged, timestamped, and cross-referenced with Whitmore's written directives. I created a paper trail so detailed and so meticulous that a Judge lawyer could have reconstructed every decision down to the minute. Because I knew, not suspected, not feared, but knew with the bone, deep certainty of 2 decades of experience that the day was coming when someone was going to need that paper trail. The first 3 weeks were quiet, and that was the worst part, because every quiet day was another data point that Whitmore could use to validate his model. He started walking around the medical facility with a little more swagger, a little more confidence, occasionally stopping to point out how smoothly everything was running under his new system. He started sending status reports up the chain with phrases like achieved 15% reduction in operational overhead and streamlined response architecture. He was building his performance review. He was building his early promotion case. He was building a monument to his own genius on a foundation of sand, and he had absolutely no idea that the tide was coming in. The thing about running a reduced supply buffer is that it works perfectly right up until the moment it doesn't. The thing about cutting your on-call staff is that you have plenty of people right up until the moment you need more. The thing about eliminating redundancy in a trauma facility is that redundancy isn't waste. Redundancy is survival. It's the difference between a system that works and a system that works until it's tested. The test came on a Thursday night at approximately 22:17 hours. I was in my quarters, not on call, because under Whitmore's new rotation, I was off duty when the alarm sounded. Not the routine alarm, the mass casualty alarm, the one that sounds like someone is trying to drill a hole through your skull with a dentist tool. I was on my feet and moving before my conscious brain had fully processed the sound, because 20 years of conditioning doesn't care what the duty roster says. A convoy had been hit, IED, followed by small arms fire. 7 casualties inbound, 3 of them critical. Under the old system, I would have had 2 full trauma teams standing by, 16 people ready to receive triage and treat. Under Whitmore's system, I had 1 team, 8 people. And one of those 8 was currently at the far end of the base dealing with a non-emergency medical issue, because Whitmore had also, in his infinite wisdom, eliminated the dedicated triage nurse position that used to handle routine sick calls separately from the trauma rotation. I arrived at the medical facility at the same time as the first ambulance. The scene was controlled chaos. My people were good, the best I'd ever worked with, and they were already moving with the practiced efficiency of professionals who had done this before. But there were too many patients and not enough hands, and I could see it on their faces, that tight, lipped look of people who were doing the math in their heads and coming up short. Whitmore was there. He'd arrived before me, which I'll give him credit for. He wasn't a coward, but he was standing in the middle of the trauma bay with his leather portfolio clutched against his chest like a shield, his face the color of old oatmeal, his eyes wide and darting from stretcher to stretcher with the expression of a man who has just realized that the spreadsheet has lied to him. The screaming probably didn't help. Spreadsheets don't scream. I took command. I didn't ask permission. I didn't consult the duty roster. I didn't check whether I was authorized to be there under the new rotation schedule. I walked in, I assessed, and I started giving orders because people were bleeding and dying, and the only thing that mattered in that moment was the medicine. The first critical patient was a specialist with penetrating abdominal trauma. Shrapnel from the IED had torn through his lower left quadrant, and he was losing blood faster than we could replace it. The second was a sergeant with bilateral leg injuries and a suspected spinal compromise. The third was a private first class with blast lung and a tension pneumothorax that needed a chest tube immediately or she was going to die in the next 4 minutes. Under the old system, each of those patients would have had a dedicated team. Under Whitmore's system, I had to choose. I put Rise on the pneumothorax because she could do a chest tube in her sleep. I took the abdominal trauma myself. And the sergeant with the spinal injury, I had to put him in a holding pattern with a single corpsman monitoring his vitals while we dealt with the two patients who were going to die first. Whitmore, to his credit again, tried to help. He came up to me while I was gloving up and asked what he could do. I looked at him, hands shaking, pupils dilated, sweat beading on a forehead that had never known a moment of real crisis before this one. And I told him to stay out of the way. Not kindly, not diplomatically. I told him that if he touched a patient, a piece of equipment, or a member of my team, I would have him physically removed from the facility. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He stepped back against the wall. The next 90 minutes were the longest of my career, and I have had some very long 90 minutes in my career. We lost the specialist on the table. His abdominal aorta had been nicked by a secondary fragment that I didn't find until I was already in his belly. And by the time I clamped it, he'd lost too much volume. I felt him go. You always feel it. There's a moment when the tissue under your hands changes, when the living warmth becomes something else, something cooler, something that tells your fingers what your monitors are about to tell your eyes. I called time of death at 23:40, 1 hour. Then I stripped my gloves, regowned, and moved to the sergeant because there were still living patients who needed me, and the dead have the patience of eternity. The private first class survived. Ray saved her. The chest tube went in clean, the lung expanded, and we stabilized her for medevac. The sergeant survived. 3 of the 4 remaining patients survived with injuries ranging from moderate to severe. One, a corporal with burns and blast concussion, went into cardiac arrest during treatment and had to be resuscitated twice, which we managed only because I pulled a medic off of wound packing duty to assist. A medic who, under the old system, would have already been assigned to cardiac support. We saved 6 out of 7. Under the old system, I believe with every fiber of my being that we would have saved all 7. That specialist, 22 years old from a town in Ohio I'd never heard of, with a picture of his girlfriend taped inside his helmet, bled out on my table because I didn't have enough hands in the room to find the secondary bleed in time, because our team had been optimized, because redundancy had been eliminated. When the last patient was stabilized and the medevac birds had come and gone and the trauma bay looked like a slaughterhouse that someone had tried to mop in a hurry, I sat down on a supply crate in the corner and put my head in my hands. I sat there for maybe 5 minutes, maybe 10, long enough for the adrenaline to ebb and the exhaustion to roll in like a fog bank. And then I stood up and I walked to my office and I pulled up the documentation log that Rise and I had been maintaining for 4 weeks. Every order, every directive, every supply reduction, every staffing change, every written memo I had submitted objecting to the changes, and every written response from Whitmore overruling those objections, every timestamp, every signature. A paper trail so clean and so comprehensive that it told a story all by itself. And the story it told was this: an inexperienced officer with no clinical background had systematically dismantled a functioning combat medical facility against the explicit, documented warnings of the senior medical officer, and a soldier had died because of it. I submitted the documentation package to Colonel Jeffries at 0600 the next morning. I seek the base JAG officer, the medical chain of command, and because I was done playing games, the Inspector General's office. I included my after-action report, the casualty timeline, and a clinical analysis showing that the response delay attributable to the staffing reduction was between 4 and 7 minutes, which in the case of the specialist's aortic injury was the difference between a survivable wound and a fatal one. The investigation took 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, Whitmore was suspended from duty. He spent most of that time in his quarters. I saw him once crossing the compound at dusk, and he looked like he'd aged 10 years. His uniform didn't squeak anymore. His portfolio was nowhere to be seen. He looked at me as I passed, and I saw something in his eyes that I recognized. It was the look of a man who has just discovered that the real world has sharp edges that his models never accounted for. I want to be clear about something. I didn't enjoy his suffering. I didn't savor it. A 22-year-old kid died on my table, and there is no amount of vindication that makes that acceptable. I would have given anything, my career, my rank, my pension, every commendation I'd ever received, to go back and have that kid walk out of my trauma bay on his own 2 feet. The documentation, the malicious compliance, all of it. I did it because I knew that Whitmore wouldn't listen to reason, and the only language his type understands is consequences. I built the case because it was the only way to stop him from getting more people killed. The investigation concluded with findings that were, in military parlance, unfavorable to Ensign Whitmore's position. The report found that his operational changes had materially degraded the medical facility's readiness posture and had been implemented over the documented objections of qualified medical personnel. The supply reduction was cited as a contributing factor in equipment delays during the mass casualty event. The staffing reduction was cited as a contributing factor in the delayed identification of the specialist's secondary injury. Whitmore was not court-martialed. The investigation determined that his actions, while catastrophically misguided, did not rise to the level of criminal negligence under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. But his fitness report was effectively a career death sentence. He was reassigned to a stateside administrative billet, the kind of assignment that officers call a terminal orbit, because you circle it until your commission expires and you drift away into civilian life. I was reinstated as the sole authority over medical operations at Outpost Meridian. The supply buffer went back to 45 days. The dual trauma teams were re-established. The on-call rotation was restored. And I added one additional protocol that hadn't existed before, a mandatory orientation requirement for any incoming officer assigned to medical oversight, consisting of a minimum 72-hour observation period during which they were required to shadow the senior medical NCO and demonstrate comprehension of every existing procedure before they were authorized to propose any changes. I called it the Whitmore Protocol. Not officially, of course. Officially, it had a proper bureaucratic title with enough acronyms to choke a horse. But my team called it the Whitmore Protocol, and everyone who came after Whitmore understood exactly what it meant, exactly why it existed. The total financial cost of the incident, including the investigation, the medical claims, the equipment that was damaged or contaminated during the understaffed response, the medevac flights that required additional support assets because our facility couldn't hold patients as long as it should have been able to, and the administrative overhead of Whitmore's reassignment and replacement was estimated at $4.7 million. That number appeared in a briefing slide at Sintiam 3 months later. I know because a friend of mine on the staff sent me a photo of it. The slide was titled Lessons Learned in Joint Medical Operations. It did not mention Whitmore by name, but it didn't need to. $4.7 million, a career. And a 22-year-old kid from Ohio who should be alive right now, probably married to that girlfriend, probably complaining about his mortgage and coaching Little League and living the quiet, ordinary life that he earned by putting on a uniform and driving down a road in a country most Americans can't find on a map. I think about him. I think about him more than I think about Whitmore. Whitmore was a symptom. The disease is older and bigger and more deeply rooted than any single Ensign with a shiny new MBA and a God complex. The disease is the belief that expertise is just another word for resistance to change. The disease is the assumption that if you can read a spreadsheet, you can run anything. A factory, a hospital, a warship, a combat medical facility. Because management is management and the details are just details. The disease is the arrogance of people who have never once been in a room where someone is dying and had to make the decision about what to do with their hands in the next 30 seconds, but who nonetheless believe they are qualified to tell the people in that room how to do their jobs more efficiently. I'm not saying experience makes you infallible. It doesn't. I've made mistakes. Every doctor has. Every soldier has. But there's a difference between making mistakes because you're human and making mistakes because you deliberately ignored the people who knew better. There's a difference between humility and hubris. And in the places where the margin between life and death is measured in minutes and millimeters, that difference is everything. I retired 18 months after the incident, full career, 30 years of combined service. They gave me a ceremony and a shadow box and a handshake from a general who mispronounced my name. And I drove home to a house that smelled like something other than iodine and diesel and ozone. My wife said I looked different. Not older, she said, just quieter. I still smell the ozone sometimes. Late at night, when the house is dark and the air conditioning hums at just the right frequency, my brain translates the sound into the background drone of a generator on a FOB. And for a moment, I'm back in the trauma bay, gloved up, lights overhead, humming with that particular fluorescent whine, waiting for the next alarm. I don't miss it exactly. But I don't not miss it either. It's the place where I was most myself. The place where everything I knew and everything I'd learned and everything I'd survived was distilled down into the only thing that mattered, which was the patient on the table in front of me. If you're listening to this and you're a young officer about to take your first real command, let me give you the only advice worth giving. Walk in quiet. Listen hard. Learn the names of the people who've been there longer than you. Learn what they know and why they know it. Earn their respect before you try to change their world. Because the people on the ground, the NCOs, the technicians, the specialists, the ones with the grease under their fingernails and the 1,000-yard stares, they are the reason the mission succeeds. They are the institutional memory. They are the ones who know where the bodies are buried, sometimes literally. And if you walk in loud, waving your degree and your theories and your operational realignment plan, if you tell them that their 20 years of hard won knowledge is just legacy thinking that needs to be disrupted, they will let you fail. They will comply with your every order, dot every I, cross every T, follow your plan to the letter, and they will let you walk straight off the cliff because you refused to listen when they told you the edge was there. And when you're falling, when the alarms are screaming and the patients are bleeding and your PowerPoint slides are burning, you'll look around for the people who could save you and you'll realize that they were trying to. The whole time, they were trying to save you from yourself. You just wouldn't let them.